when we're addressing hip issues, we need to understand the relationship between the femur and the hip and the pelvis. So the femur and the hip can move through 6 different positions in 3 planes of motion. We have flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, internal rotation, and external rotation. But these movements will depend on your pelvis position. So if my pelvis is stuck, let's say in an anterior tilt where we have that big lumbar curve, for me to get hip flexion, it's going to be limited. And when I try and get hip extension, we might not have true hip extension where the glute's contracting because our spine is arching and we're not getting that relative movement at the hip. Whereas if I keep a neutral pelvis in this position, trying to maintain that and trying to lift the knee, I'll have a lot more movement in hip flexion, and as I go back, I'll get a true hip extension where I get my glute contracting. So it's important to understand those relationships. The other thing that's important to understand is the difference between an open chain exercise and a closed chain exercise. A closed chain exercise will look at the foot being on the ground, and an open chain exercise will look at the foot being in the air. So you might find that you're training your glutes and you might be on your hands and knees doing a hip extension exercise. That would be an open chain movement. Hip extension in the closed chain would be a posterior pelvic tilt, or a step forward with the pelvis will leave my hip in extension. Alternatively, you might have a side-to-side movement, laying on your side and raising your leg out to the side would be an abduction. In closed chain, that's going to appear as a shift away, which creates that same angle in the hip. Or it may be a hike movement when you're running and one knee comes up and the pelvis hikes away from that leg. That hip is going to be left in an abduction. Finally, if we look at the rotational element, we have an internal rotation and an external rotation. If our feet are on the ground, we can rotate our pelvis to create those movements. So if I rotate my pelvis towards, my hip is left in an internal rotation. If I rotate my pelvis away, my hip is left in an external rotation. So take these into consideration. Exercises that you're about to do through the movement series, try and maintain that lumbar control and that pelvis control, and really focus on what your hip is doing to feel those tissues around the glute, around the hip flexors and adductors.